Hi, I'm Christopher Walker with Closely Observed Literature.
Hello, I am Matilda Walker. Bye bye.
She had to be in it. I'll find a use for her. I haven't posted much in the last year. Or to be more accurate, I haven't posted in the last year. But that doesn't mean I haven't been reading. And in fact, last year was a good year for reading for me because most of the books I read were paperbacks and it was a great break from screen time, from online teaching. I think I managed to read 52 books. My target had been 40, but I did well. It was a good year. So in this video, I want to recap last year, my reading of the year, and I'm going to tell you about my top 5 books of the year and some of the other books that I recommend. I'm not going to spend long talking about each one, so if you're looking for a more in-depth summary or analysis of the books, in other words, if you want literature that's closely observed, stay tuned for future videos where I really get into some of these books in a bit more detail. For now, I just want to recommend a couple of books that you might want to check out yourself. So if you're interested, stay tuned.
Number 5, The Awakening.
So when I first got my Kindle, and this is one of the Kindle books on my list, when I first got the Kindle, Amazon, for some reason, were offering their Amazon Classics for free. So I went through and downloaded a whole load of them because, you know, they're the classics and you expect that one day you'll read them. But then you don't, because there are other things that aren't classics. Well, I finally got round to reading some of them in the last 12 months or so. And one that I really enjoyed was by Chopin, or Chopin, I don't know how you say it actually. She wrote a book called Awakening. Quite a short book, and it has a few short stories appended to the end. The stories were okay, but I kind of rushed through them a little bit. They didn't really catch my attention. But Awakening itself was pretty cool. And it was the awakening of a woman's sensibility and her knowledge of herself, let's say. So you have a woman who's married and she just suddenly decides, really, based on a couple of other experiences, that actually she doesn't really like the life that she's chosen for herself. One little spoiler alert, when they say, as I've said in other videos, most stories end with either death or a marriage. If the woman's already married at the start of the book, in this sort of classical period, you can kind of guess where it ends up. And that was a shame because I felt like if it hadn't ended that way, there was real scope for a truly modern novel to emerge there. You know, instead of what happens happening, what if something else had happened? What if something more constructive had gone on? But I guess that's what the literature of the last 60 years is for, compared to the literature that preceded it. Anyway, I was really glad that I spent the time reading this classic, and I'm glad to have it listed on my top 5 for the year.
Number 4, Cowboy Graves.
Next up, we've got Cowboy Graves by Roberto Bolaño. I'm not going to spend too long talking about this or telling you about the stories because I'm planning a much bigger video that examines as much of the Bolaño canon as I can. I'm a bit of a collectionist when it comes to this Chilean writer, and I've got almost everything that he produced aside from his poetry. So when I get to it, I'll definitely be making a much longer, bigger video that gives you a guide through his work. But one of the things that's kind of grated a little bit, because the poor guy died way ahead of his time, was that publishers have spent the last 5 or 10 years going through his old stories, his juvenilia a little bit, some of the less mature pieces, the less finished pieces, and thinking to themselves, well, there's an audience, we can put these all together and we can sell a book. And at first I thought Cowboy Graves would be like that, but because I was curious, I got it. And there's some real quality in there. Like I say, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but some of his short stories there are fantastic. I wouldn't say it's quite as good as the best of The Insufferable Gaucho, is that how I said it? That I read a couple of years previously. But all the same, Cowboy Graves is definitely worth a read. Some of the stories are very memorable, and they are very much Bolaño stories, and that, I think, is what you come for.
Number 3, Peace on Earth.
Next on the list then is Peace on Earth by the great Polish science fiction author Stanislaw Lem. I made a video on one of my other channels a little while back explaining the reasons why I moved to Poland. Lem was one of them. I fell in love with his writing around the time I went to university, and that's probably when I first developed my attachment to Poland. It's funny how writers can do that, you know. They speak for their country, whether they like it or not, or whether they know it or not. I would like to visit Chile, simply because that's where Bolaño originated. I want to visit anyway. Peace on Earth then. The idea, the central conceit, is that all modern weaponry is now based on the moon. And artificial intelligence systems are in charge of developing new forms of destruction, and all wars are fought by proxy. You have these different competing technological races up on the moon. But for a while, nobody's heard anything. They don't know what's going on. So they find an astronaut, they send them off to the moon, and his job is to find out what on earth is going on there. Because they're worried. What if the AI on the moon has decided that they want to attack the Earth? They have no idea. Something happens to the astronaut though whilst he's on the moon. He sees something, but after he has seen it, his brain is effectively split. The two hemispheres are separated one from the other, and he returns to Earth with incomplete memories and suffering a kind of split personality syndrome. And the whole novel revolves around answering that question of what happened? How can you know what happened? What happens to people who lose that part of their brain, that part of themselves? It's a very clever psychological book, and it really asks a lot of questions about personality and the psyche and the workings of the brain. It's also fun. It has real moments of wit. These are the hallmarks of good Stanislaw Lem writing, and it's no wonder that it features pretty high up on my list of books. So yeah, Peace on Earth, highly recommended.
Ready? Number 2, The Songlines.
Songlines by Bruce Chatwin is the only piece of non-fiction on my top 5, but it deserves its place. It's set in Australia, and it describes Chatwin's adventure there. Now, Australia has not always been the most interesting of places for me to read books about, although having said that, Terra Nullius by Sven Lindqvist is excellent, and I quite enjoyed the Bill Bryson book set down there. But it's not really a country with what you would consider a long and varied history, not like other parts of the world. But I think that's doing it a disservice, and Songlines really kind of corrected me with that. So Bruce Chatwin was most interested in the Aboriginal people of Australia, interested too in the whites, the colonialists, the people who had moved there, who'd been transported there. But most of all, I think he was sensitive to the people that originally occupied that land and to their traditions. And it was fascinating stuff. But what really elevates Songlines, and what really I think makes it into a classic of the genre, is that for a period, and it fits quite nicely into the narrative, Chatwin is kind of isolated for a while. He's not able to move on from where he is. And as he says himself, this was a perfect opportunity to go through the notes that he'd been making over the previous however many years, and to kind of try and bring order to them all. And in this little departure from his narrative of Australia, he talks about the nomadic life what it means to wander, what it means to explore. And there's so much there to pore over that if I was going to quote any of it, I'd have to quote all of it, because it just builds layer upon layer, like the old masters used to paint. And it's so good. Just thinking about it makes me want to reread that particular chapter. So I think I might do that once I've finished editing this video, just go back over it. So yeah, Songlines by Bruce Chatwin. Magnificent stuff.
The best of the rest.
So before I tell you my personal favourite book of the year, let me just quickly recap some of the best of the rest. Some real gems here, and it was difficult not to include them in the top 5. A couple of rereads, so Decline and Fall by Evelyn Waugh and Laughable Loves by Milan Kundera were 2 books that I read a long time ago, but I couldn't remember them very well. And I think we actually did a bit of Decline and Fall in school, which surprises me now, considering some of the subject matter, not exactly in keeping with what you would expect at a public school. Then there were 2 works of what you might consider genius, but because they were genius, they were hard work. The Enchantress of Florence by Salman and Rushdie was magnificent, but it took me a long time to read because it was just pretty heavy going. It was just so full on. And likewise Foucault's Pendulum by Umberto. Magnificent book. But when he goes off, sends the characters off to Brazil, I think it was, I kind of lost it a little bit, because it talks about so many kind of folk myths and religions and belief systems that I just had never heard of before. It was difficult to kind of anchor myself in the story, and it was the biggest and densest book that I read in that year. I have to say, after the first 5-10 pages, I kind of considered giving up, but I've been told so many times it's a work of genius, you got to read it, so I did, and I agree, it was a work of genius. But that doesn't take away from the fact that it was a bit of work some of the time, and therefore not in a kind of personal top 5. And then finally there was Willa Cather's book Death Comes for the Archbishop, which I liked a lot more than I thought I would do, given the subject matter. I'm not really big into religious topics, but it worked for me. Very nicely well written. The sort of writing that doesn't draw attention to itself, which is the sort of writing I go for these days, to be honest. I remember reading, what was it, Mothering Sunday or something like that. Well, it was a nice book, but the writing was a little bit too kind of like, hey, look at me, I'm writing, woo. So it didn't really do it for me. Sorry, Graham Swift, and fans of Graham Swift. So yeah, now that I've read Death Comes for the Archbishop, I've also downloaded onto my Kindle all the other books that I can find by Willa Cather, so I imagine I'll be returning to her books in the near future. Is it her? I think it's her. I think so. So that's the best of the rest. And before I move on to number 1, I ought to really give a shout out to the one independent writer that I read last year. I read a short story collection called Moments of the Chosen by a friend of mine, Jerome Washington. So it was a good read. I'm glad that I read it. Well done to Jerome for actually putting it together. He put it together as a bilingual edition, so well done to the translator as well. No, it's a nice little effort. I'm looking forward to the sophomore effort of Mr. Washington's. Hopefully he's going to be continuing with his craft, taking on board the lessons we all learn from reading other people. I have high hopes. It's a good one. So yeah, that was the best of the rest. I could have listed pretty much everything I read last year. There's nothing that was a real stinker. So let's move on and bring this long video to a close.
Number 1, Stoner.
All of which brings me to number 1 on the list. It's difficult to put things in order when it comes to books because I love so many of the books that I read, but this one really did feel like it stood out. It's described as being the greatest book you've never heard of, but I think a lot of people who like books have heard of it. Whether you've read it or not is another matter. And this book is Stoner by John Williams. No, it's not that John Williams, and no, Stoner isn't that kind of a reference, so calm yourselves. It's the story of a man who falls in love with the academic life. He didn't know that this was what he was built for, but it is. And he spends his life working at a university in the English department. So hints of autobiographical stuff in there, I should imagine. Certainly a little hint of it, at least. As well as being a story of a man's life, it's also an exploration of what happens when you try to follow a moral code and you try to do what's right. But in this world of ours, doing the right thing isn't always rewarded, and often it's punished. And there are 3 little episodes in this book, so spoiler alert, I suppose. I'll try to keep it vague enough. But there are 3 particular episodes that really stick in mind. The first is the, let's call it disciplinary meeting involving one of the students who is something of a Boris Johnson character. Gets by just kind of blagging his way, and Stoner won't stand for it, but others in the department will. And that interaction is just class. It is so well done. Then the second part is the growth and then sudden death of the relationship between Stoner and his daughter, and that really tugged at the heartstrings. Again, very sensitively done, wonderfully crafted little episode. It's not the death of the daughter, in case you're wondering if it's that sort of a book, but it's a much more subtle thing. The relationship that had sprung up between the two, the kinship that he felt, and then it is taken away from him in the most tragic of ways. Horrible. Very moving. And then the last part is the true love he experiences in his life. But again, as a consequence of his moral actions, even that is denied him. It's very, very delicately written, but in a kind of not simple exactly sort of way, but a very I would say almost laconic manner. Doesn't draw attention to itself. So my book of the year, without a doubt, is Stoner. If you've not read it before, read it. It is magnificent. So there you have it, guys. My top 5 and a few others for the year. It's always difficult to select because I feel like it's a self-selecting crowd, the books that I go for. I don't take too many chances with my reading. I usually go for books that I know because of the publisher or because of recommendations before I'm probably going to enjoy. So yeah, there's not much risk taking involved, unfortunately. But it has been a good year, the last 12 months. And this year is already setting itself up quite nicely. Now that we're back to normal teaching and I don't have to spend my life in front of a computer screen, I think there'll be more videos to come. So thank you for watching this one. Thank you to those of you who have subscribed. And for now, from me and from Matilda, see you next time. Bye bye.
The clouds.
The clouds.